what time is it now? Oh, can I ask a question in a minute?
Of course.
When Wyoming granted women the right to vote, was it clear that it was all women? I assume Native women were not permitted to vote.
Correct. That is correct. Yeah. And I will do my best to make sure that we reference not only the fact that last year was the 150th anniversary of women's suffrage in Wyoming, but also that it did not grant everybody the right to vote.
Interesting, yes.
And Representative Clifford was really strong on that point when we were working on when there were women's suffrage bills and that sort of thing. And now it's 5 o'clock. So I'll be quiet.
Awesome, yeah, well, we'll get started. Hi everyone, my name is Anna Marquise and I'm the Civic Engagement Coordinator for the Equality State Policy Center. And welcome to the People's Review Live, hosted by us, the Equality State Policy Center. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to improve the lives of all Wyoming's people through transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. The People's Review Live is designed to help people all across Wyoming engage with the government and keep up with important issues and debates. When we work together, we can ensure transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. That's never been more important than it is right now. I want to hand things over to Chris Merrill, ESPC's Executive Director, to talk a little bit more about our work, give a quick overview of housekeeping, introduce our moderator, and all of our panelists.
Thanks, Anna. And thank you everyone who's joining us this evening. We're excited to get started. We have a lot of people tuned in, so all attendees, when you join, you're automatically muted. But we'll be posting resources in the chat as we go along. And we encourage you, when you have questions, to post them in the chat as well. And then, we'll do our best to get to them, get to as many as we can. And if you have tech issues, please just in the chat, you can chat directly to the host, who is Anna, and she should be able to help you out. So I am excited to introduce our panelists and moderator for tonight. And I will begin with one of our panelists who will be arriving shortly. And her name is Amber McReynolds, and she's one of the country's leading experts on election administration and policy, and co-author of the book, When Women Vote. Amber is the CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute and Coalition, and is the former director of elections for Denver, Colorado. And her work demonstrates that designing pro-voter policies and voter-centric processes and implementing technical innovations will improve representation for all voters. Our next panelist is Cynthia Ritchie Terrell. Welcome, Cynthia. She's the founder and executive director of Represent Women and a founding board member of the Reflect Us Coalition of nonpartisan women's representation organizations. She's an outspoken advocate for innovative rules and systems reforms to advance women's representation and leadership in the United States. Our next panelist is Wyoming State Representative Andy Clifford from House District 33. Yay, Andy. She's an enrolled member of the Northern Arapaho Tribe. She's currently the Assistant General Manager of the Wind River Hotel and Casino, where she's worked for more than a decade. And she has served as a Fremont County Commissioner, a Wyoming Humanities Council board member, and on the board of the Wind River Tribal College. She holds BS and MPA degrees from the University of Wyoming. Welcome, Representative Clifford. And our final panelist is Marguerite Herman. She's a lobbyist for the League of Women Voters of Wyoming and has advocated on the local, state, and national level in Wyoming for several other groups, including the PTA, the U.S. Breastfeeding Committee, the American Cancer Society, and the Advocates for School Trust Lands. She currently serves as a trustee for Laramie County School District No. 1, and Marguerite wrote the most recent edition of the Wyoming League of Women Voters, A Look at Wyoming Government. Welcome, Marguerite. And our moderator this evening is Jen Simon. She is Senior Policy Advisor to the Equality State Policy Center. She's the director of our Gender Lens Project and the founder of the Wyoming Women's Action Network. She's also part of the team that launched the Brewer Fellowship to Unite America, where both Amber and Cynthia are part of the inaugural cohort of fellows. She'll be moderating tonight, and I'll hand it over to her now. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you, and thanks to all of our panelists. We're so excited you're here. Forgive me for my kind of obsessive punctuality in terms of getting going at 5 o'clock, regardless of whether everybody's with us. I appreciate everybody's flexibility, and thanks to everybody who showed up. We have a big crowd today, which is great. We're excited. As we get started, I want to provide a little context for the conversation we're hoping to have over the next hour. I also want to point out some key milestones. I have visual aids. I have the Represent Women. It is the story of women leaders for 2020. If you don't have this, you want this. And it has helped immensely in terms of pointing out all of the different history of women that has not necessarily been recorded all in one place. If you are attending right now, we're going to pick somebody at random and send you a copy of it. Same thing with Amber's book. I have other visual aids. So lots of door prizes today. But what I love about this and why it's important to me is that I think it speaks to a couple of the things that contextualize this conversation. One is that, as all of you who are here in Wyoming with us know, 2019 marked the 150th anniversary of the women's suffrage in Wyoming, but it wasn't a victory for all women. It recognized the inherent right to vote and hold office for certain women, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, who was included, who was not included. The same thing's true for this year, 2020. It marks the centennial of the 19th Amendment, but again, that wasn't a guarantee of voting rights for everyone in the country. So we want to talk more about what that looks like, what barriers still exist, what solutions are out there, and what all of that means for electing more women. And so July in particular, we're excited about. It features pivotal moments in history for women's suffrage. In 1848 in July was the Seneca Falls Convention, and so we're particularly happy that every Monday night in July, ESPC is hosting candidate leadership forums and trainings, and that we have this as our featured event for the month. So that's kind of the larger context. I want to, again, speak to Cynthia's points in her fabulous day planner and say the first woman elected chief was Rosanna Shoto of the Osage Beaver Band of the Osage Nation in Oklahoma in 1875. The first elected congresswoman was Jeanette Rankin in Montana in 1916, and I think Cynthia's got a little bit of context about that as we go through. The first Republican woman to serve in the Senate was Gladys Pyle of South Dakota in 1938, and of course the first governor of a state was Nellie Taylor Ross right here in Wyoming in 1925. And so I want to kick it off by talking about the fact that Western states have really been early adopters in a lot of the history of women's suffrage and also voting reforms. But let's just start with the 19th Amendment. Amber, would you talk a little bit about how it was passed and who it was for, and maybe who was excluded?
Sure. Well, thanks, Jen, and thank you for having me here tonight. It's really an honor to be on this panel, especially with so many amazing women that are leading in various ways. The 19th Amendment, I think it's interesting that we're here at this moment in time where we're celebrating 100 years. And then in thinking about not only sort of who was enfranchised at that time, which was mostly white women at the time, but then also looking back over our country's history in the fact that that our democracy has, and really the powers that be that have run the democracy have left various people out of the process, and that's still happening today. And we've seen various examples of that. The 19th Amendment was a major milestone, but at the same time, still we on the one hand came really far, and on the other we have a long way to go. And that process, I think it's interesting because it certainly states were leading, Wyoming being the first territory to enfranchise women. Colorado was the first state to pass the initiative with a citizens referendum after it had failed multiple times in the legislature. And, I always say that passing it at the citizen level, it required more than 50% of men to cast ballots because women couldn't vote in that, right? So there had to be a campaign run on that. It happened well in advance of the 19th Amendment, so 1893. And Western states generally, to your point, led, and they were the first to enfranchise women. What's interesting when we fast forward to today is that Western states have also led in terms of enfranchising the electorate at large. So we have way more accessible voting processes, including all of the states that automatically mail a ballot to every elector in advance of the election are all Western states. The advancement of vote centers and early voting also happened in the West. The modernization of voter registration, meaning same-day registration and automatic registration, also has been advanced in the West. The Western states have also led. Colorado was the first state to adopt risk limiting audits, which enhances security in the election process. So Western states generally have had far better access to the voting process, and that frankly started with the movement around women's suffrage. And we've continued to see that over and over and over. And even if you look at the map of states today, that are states that mail a ballot or provide significant access in the voting process, that map actually is almost a replica of what women's suffrage looked like before the 19th Amendment actually passed. So, you know, I think it's indicative really of the pioneer spirit in Western states, but we've continued to see it over and over, understanding that there's still significant gaps. Colorado's never had a woman senator or a woman governor. We've still got these major gaps, even though we've achieved other pieces along the way.
Thank you, Amber. And I want to turn to you, Representative Clifford. Would you talk to us a little bit about, I know that you did quite a lot of work in 2019 with the women's suffrage sesquicentennial and pointing out really the places that Indigenous women in our state have been disenfranchised or enfranchised. Would you talk a little bit about that and the history of when Indigenous women got the right to vote?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. Great, awesome. Thankful to be here in honor of my Indigenous women and ancestors. With the suffrage movement, what I know is growing up on the Wind River Indian Reservation, you didn't hear my grandparents talk about it much. My mother was involved in politics. Her influence was tribal politics. So when you look at the whole scheme of things, growing up on the Wind River Reservation here, growing up in Wyoming, and being a legislator now, we're here at 2020, we weren't invited to the table. My grandpa was 12 years old when he finally became a citizen of the United States. And so even though the women's suffrage had passed 150 years, my grandmothers weren't invited to the table. My grandmothers weren't invited to the polling places. And so even when I was growing up, born in the 1970s, you didn't hear them talk about voting. You didn't hear them talking about exercising your right to vote because it just wasn't important, and we weren't here. But knowing the history of my people, the Indigenous people here, our peoples were egalitarian, meaning that women had a place. They were respected in politics. They were respected in their governments. And the reason why, it's to me really simple. They were the givers of life. They were able to give life. And so they were respected and revered on a whole nother level because they were able to give that life and carry life. And so that whole perspective and being able to educate people and have them become aware of that is my purpose, is my journey, and it is a space and a voice that I need to, I need to share, and I'm honored to share that. And so it's changing. Women are at the forefront. We are the backbone of our family here. A lot of embedded leaders are females here. You go to grandmas, and when they talk about politics, they're going to tell you how they feel about things. And they're going to tell a lot of their family members, extended family members, who we should be voting for and why. And so we have these embedded leaders throughout the reservation in various communities. And that's who I rely on and who I go talk to, especially when I ran my campaign, were those really strong Indigenous women leaders that are the backbone of their families. And so it's important to see that. it's kind of like coming full circle with colonization and all of that stuff. And so it's exciting to see us. We have a long ways to go as far as getting involved with our politics up and down the ballot and what affects us as Indigenous people. We're moving in the right direction, which is very inspiring to see. But there's a lot more that we could do here for Indigenous people as a whole. And I see that movement, and it's very positive. And I know my plight as an Indigenous woman serving in the state of Wyoming is to lead a path and then step aside and have my younger generations, the future generations, do way more than what I did. And I take that role to educate people and know that we're still here as Indigenous people. We're resilient, we're powerful, we're perseverant, but again, we're here and we want to be at the table and we want to be part of the solutions for what can help us and our communities.
Well, thank you. I want to pick up on what you're saying in terms of who's at the table and who's invited to the table. And Cynthia, would you talk a little bit about existing barriers to access in terms of women fully engaging with the voting process kind of nationally? And then I want to switch over to you, Marguerite, and think about what that means, what that looks like in Wyoming. So Cynthia, if you've got thoughts for us on the barriers to access that still exist, and what that then means in terms of representation for women. Oh, you're muted still.
Trying my best not to make noise before I was asked to. Thanks so much for having me on this panel. I'm really learning a lot so far, so I appreciate being with you. In terms of voting, I think Amber really indicated a lot of the barriers that exist in terms of a lack of consistency across the states, and even across jurisdictions within states about how to access the ballot, how to request it, what that process is there postage on the ballot that's required to be returned, what are the deadlines for requesting the ballot, even places that I think sometimes have a reputation of being quite liberal in some ways. Blue states like New York has very restrictive rules around voting that make it very difficult to vote in a party primary. If you're not registered in that primary, you have to register in that primary really months ahead of the filing deadlines for the candidates before you even know who's running. So how would you know which party primary you wanted to register in? So I think that a lot of those the inconsistencies derive from the fact that there's not an affirmative right to vote in the US Constitution. In other words, there are preventions against the vote being infringed upon, but there's not a classical, in the sense of other countries, affirmative, universal right to vote, and a system where we register everybody and people can opt out of the system. In the United States, people have to opt into the system, and that really does put an additional burden on people who have less access to technology, to the post office, to traveling. Maybe they're working on a number of jobs on the day of election, which is just one day. In the traditional old school pre-Amber McReynolds way of voting, where you had to go to a place with certain specified hours and wait in line. Anyway. So I think those are a lot of the barriers that exist for voters in general. I think it's an interesting thing to point out that here we are 100 years after suffrage was passed, and women make up the majority of the electorate, particularly the primary electorate in states like Maryland. There's a huge gender break in terms of the proportion of women being higher who are participating in a lot of primary elections. But interestingly, of course, that doesn't translate into representation. And I can go into more detail about this later. I don't want to take too much time, but I think there are barriers for women who are running for office around whether they're recruited or not, whether they have money to run viable campaigns. There are barriers that have to do with our voting system. We have a very antiquated voting system, winner-take-all voting system, which make it hard for challengers and newcomers to politics to win overall. we have barriers once women get elected to serving effectively. Women, of course, and men share the burden of parenting, but many of those burdens fall on women. And so asking questions about whether there's on-site childcare or paid leave for elected officials, what the compensation is there proxy voting? Can you participate virtually? And now, because of the virus, a lot of those conversations I think are accelerating, which is a good thing. And then finally, I would say there are barriers to women's leadership because we just don't have systems in place that advance women regularly into party leadership positions, committee leadership positions, and all the positions that equip women to then seek or be appointed to higher office.
Thank you. And Marguerite, will you talk a little bit about what some of that looks like here in Wyoming in terms of barriers to participation and also Cynthia's points about, you know, barriers to leadership, barriers to being elected, because I want to go from here, just to give you all the heads up and telegraph where I'm going. I want to go from here into what kind of solutions can we be talking about, because I know everybody on this panel has great thoughts and is doing work in that space. So how do we move in the direction of greater engagement in the electorate, greater voter participation, and more diverse leadership? But so with that, Marguerite, I'd love for you to give a Wyoming perspective on some of this as well.
Well, thank you, Jen. So I lobby for the League of Women Voters of Wyoming, but I moved here in 1980 as a reporter with the Associated Press. So for 40 years, I've been following the legislature, the trends, the ups and the downs. And, you know, when we were talking before we started about how we talk about women in government and seem to focus on the legislature and how many other really useful, helpful offices there are below that. But let's talk about the legislature briefly. And there has never, in 1980, there seemed to be more women in general. And it seemed like the leadership was pretty amenable to making them into committee chairman, which is sort of the ladder up to leadership. And there was a point earlier in the 2000s where a woman was a speaker pro tem. No, she was a vice president she was a majority floor leader and really slated to become speaker. And then she lost her subsequent election to in one of those really conservative races, and she was deemed too moderate. So we got close, that glass ceiling. She was almost there, and actually, I think she would have been a great speaker. So,
and I'm going to add to that the minority floor leader at the same time was a woman.
Yes. So and you know, by all accounts, the women have done great in their leadership positions as committee chairman and as you know, floor managers and that sort of thing. But I think what we talked about is the critical mass of women who are in the legislature has dwindled for reasons we'll get into. But I think a leadership does appreciate competency, and the women who are committee chairmen have done a fantastic job by all accounts. So I think when they get into leadership positions, they are, you know, when they're trusted by the leadership, the speaker and the president, they accept, they do a fantastic job, and their authority is well considered. And I think, you know, I will just have to say, I think women getting into offices on the county level, on the local level, school district level, I think, you know, they develop certain competencies and competences. And, you know, we mentioned the pressures of family life, and that a woman a little bit older, perhaps, that family life obligation doesn't keep her so close to home, because by the time you know, the legislative races roll around, there is a lot of travel. There has been previously, and it's tough for women to serve. But a lot of opportunities on the lower level. I think probably, you know, school board is more open to gender diversity. We were talking about how city councils, not so much. Cheyenne just got its first female mayor. and the county commissioners. So, you know, getting women in the more local races, I think will help help them make a case when they do run for legislature or Congress or the Senate. And why that is so, well, again, we'll get into that in a little bit, but it's true that the numbers have dwindled in the 1980s. There seemed to be a lot more fluidity, and we'll see if we can get back to those days. But I will have to say that the people who do get elected have done great jobs. They're trusted. They're in trusted positions, and they've come close. And I think it may be upon us, but take some of those really top, the president and the speaker position.
Thanks, Marguerite. I think this whole conversation makes me think of, Amber, a line in your book. I'm going to plug your book one more time. Everybody should get the book, When Women Vote. But you talk about, you say, change the way we vote and more people vote. And when more people vote, more women get elected. And so I'd love to come back to you and then start back through in this discussion with all of us. Can you talk a little bit about your particular, your work right now in terms of vote by mail, but that broader, how do we change the way we vote and engage more people in the electorate so that we can then start to talk about the other pieces that go with this?
Yeah, well, you know, when we look at 2016, it was 61% turnout, and there's 80 million people that were eligible and registered to vote that did not participate. 2018, it was closer to 120 million people and only 50% turnout, but 120 million people that were registered to vote did not vote. And so when we look at that and then we dig into that and find that 40% or so of those individuals through polling data indicated that convenience was part of the reason, not a lack of desire to vote, but convenience, or not being able to get off work, or having childcare issues, or all of these different things. And then when you dive into sort of who's elected and the lack of women's representation, and even though women vote when they're above the age of 55 or so at much higher levels, younger women are not as engaged in the political process. And when you dive into a lot of those numbers, you find lower turnout rates among single mothers and students that are going to school, that kind of thing. And I'm a single mom myself with a 7 and a 9-year-old. I'm a 95% parent. So the challenge is that, you know, I'm grateful for my situation, but I know that my peers that are also single mothers that have very difficult and very trying circumstances, voting is not going to be the top of their list if they're trying to just simply put food on the table and get their kids home from school in a safe way. And if they pull up and there's a 4-hour line, I can tell you what they're not going to do. They're not going to stand in line with small children. And so the system overall is really what we try to highlight in the book as being inaccessible to many people. And it isn't, it doesn't work for all, it works for some. And, you know, we found that repeatedly. There's a fairness challenge, whether it be with primaries and independents being left out, or party folks. We interviewed a woman in Texas who's a Republican who feels like her vote doesn't count ever because she lives in a very blue district and she believes that her participation in primaries doesn't matter. So we see this fairness question come up broadly, and I believe turnout is an indicator that the system is not working well for a vast number of people. And then when we dive in and find out that you're actually more eligible to vote in some states than you are others, there's significant differences and disparities with the options that people have to vote, the ease of access, that kind of thing. And then when we just see even close to 20 or even 25 point differences in states turnout, and then you directly tie that to access and policies and all of that, that voting transaction is not working. And that is particularly challenging then when we, you know, go into then who's elected, who serves. You don't see many single mothers in legislative bodies or even in Congress. I think there's one right now. You don't see that. And then you think about the perspective that, and just as using it as an example, a single mother has with regards to education and healthcare and work-life balance, and does it work to get off school at 3 o'clock every day? So these are all the things that don't get addressed, partly because there's a lack of representation, but also because there's a lack of prioritization of policies. And we have to figure out a way to get beyond that. And I truly believe that when the populace, when we get these 80 million people or the 120 million people to vote and to participate, we're going to force politicians to look more broadly beyond their base, beyond the number 4 or number 5 on the voter file for how many people have voted lately, beyond all of that, and truly engage a broader audience in policy discussions. And that helps everybody. And that's what we need to see, is bigger engagement in all of these discussions, not just this sort of what I would call mediocre at best turnout that the United States consistently has.
Absolutely. And I think Representative Clifford, that's something that you bring up frequently in terms of your policy discussions and being at the table and how you best represent the population that you serve. And I wonder if you might want to comment on that, whether that's in terms of voter access or policies, if you've got thoughts on that you want to throw into the mix right now. She may also have internet challenges, so we can circle back around. But I think that that's a good place to pick up in terms of how we get more voices at the table, how we get a more diverse perspective, because the policy that we get obviously reflects the people we elect. And so I think that Amber has teed it up well for Cynthia. Maybe we can talk now about the systemic changes that would actually benefit all of us by having different people elected. And so would you talk a little about ranked choice voting, multi-winner districts, some of the systems that Represent Women really looks at to say, hey, these would benefit all of us by having more diverse leadership.
Right. Well, looking at that frame that I was talking about earlier, when you think of barriers to women running, barriers to women winning, barriers to women serving, and barriers to women leading, we try to look at our reforms, our advocacy is focused on those 4 collections of barriers. And so when you think of women, who are not certain whether they're going to run or not, there's, I think, some real key system strategies that we can employ, partly modeled on the 80 or so countries that rank above the United States in women's representation, where systems interventions are working very well at the local and state level to have parties be recruiting more women to run, albeit sometimes in different kinds of systems, but the philosophy behind it, I think, is the same, which is that there are these gatekeepers. They're either party elected officials who control who's a viable candidate, or donors, or in this country, political action committees, who all, right now, in some ways conspire, whether consciously or not, to maintain the status quo, to fortify the status quo. So our work at Represent Women is looking at interventions to get more parties to recruit, to make a commitment to recruiting more women to run, and to meet with the groups that are equipping and preparing individual women to run, and also to work with political action committees to be more accountable in their giving. We just did a big study that we released a couple weeks ago about all member PACs and the amount of money that they're giving to women candidates. And there's a lot of disparity in terms of what kinds of candidates get supported. It's very hard to get money from these institutional funders if you're running as a challenger or in an open seat race. Funders really prefer to give to incumbents. So we're working with political parties and political action committees and donors to be more intentional about supporting women's candidacies and helping them run viable campaigns. Then we're also really focused on systems that ensure that there's more likelihood that women and people of color will win when they run. Right now we have, for most of the country, a very antiquated system that was built over 240 years ago that really is intended to you know, again, limit competition and keep the incumbents in office. So in order to break that up, we have to look at reforms like ranked choice voting, as you mentioned, and look at the composition of districts, which we can talk a little bit about if people are interested. I know that's one of my favorite topics, so people have to like stop me from going into too much detail.
Good to know.
But the gist is, yeah, for a long time, part of the reason that there's this rich history of women getting elected, particularly in Western states and in plain states, is that those states employed districts that elected more than one representative. And when you're electing 2 people or 3 people or 4 people or 5 people for a geographic area, it's more likely that voters are going to feel comfortable casting a vote for a woman candidate. And it's frankly more likely that those gatekeepers that I just spoke about are likely to recruit a woman to run because they see the value in having a balanced ticket. So those multi-seat districts can be used at the local level. They're used in many city councils now. Women do better on city councils where they're elected at large. There are 10 states that use multi-seat districts right now. I'm sitting in Maryland that uses 3 to 5 seat districts, and New Hampshire and West Virginia also use districts that have more than 3 people in them. And not surprisingly, women's representation in those multi-seat districts is twice what it is in the single member districts. But if you just have winner-take-all at-large districts, it can really hurt racial minorities because the way that the elections that we've seen this in the South throughout the 1900s. And so combining it with ranked choice voting, which perhaps people on this call are familiar with it, but just a quick lesson on it is voters get to say, here's my first choice, second choice, third choice. If somebody wins a majority, that's great, they're elected. If they don't, the last place finisher is eliminated and the remaining votes are spread out to the other finishers. And that really, the data on the jurisdictions which use ranked choice voting is very compelling. Women are running and winning about 50% of the seats for the executive races and about 50% of the city council seats, which is significantly above the norm. So I've been talking for a while. Maybe I better stop there. There's more to be said. But
no,
one of the things I will say that I'm not sure that I said earlier, but the advantage of changing a system or a rule is that it's more enduring. If we just focus on preparing individuals to win and to run, then often those, the last to arrive are often the first to go. But if you change a system, and I often use the example of the cutouts and sidewalks for wheelchairs that the Americans with Disability Act led to, that benefits everybody. It's easier for everybody to get up and down the curb, people with strollers and bicycles and et cetera. And it's very hard to go back. Once you've put that structural remedy in place, it's very hard to remove that structural remedy. So we think some of these systems reforms will have that same lasting impact that other structural reforms have had in this country.
And Amber, it looked like maybe you were going to jump in. I don't want to put you on the spot if you
Well,
weren't.
I was going to, when Cynthia was explaining ranked choice, I was going to just mention Wyoming used ranked choice voting for the presidential primary for the Democratic side. I was involved in that project, and as combined with the vote by mail aspect, and made their election pandemic proof. So it, went very well, good audit up there. So I think it was a great example of what can be done with some good reforms to make sure that everybody's got access.
Well, and I'd be curious while we're on this subject. So our Secretary of State obviously sent absentee ballots to everybody in the state because of the pandemic. No, Marguerite's shaking her head no. All registered voters. I should have said all registered voters. Is that what I got wrong?
No, actually, he didn't send out the ballots. He sent out
notices,
invitations, because there was a lot of hair on fire over that. And so, yeah, but they were, a note that what you can do, information and a reminder and a welcome. Yeah, which was good.
Well, that's where I was going. I appreciate you correcting me. And so I was going to ask for all of you, but especially you, Marguerite, right now, to weigh in on your thoughts in terms of that particular tool, that outreach, how that's likely to affect the upcoming primary and then the general election. And then probably we'll go to Amber on that too.
Well, and let me just, if I could just back up just a tad. So the League of Women Voters spends a lot of energy on getting out the vote, but also registration. And I have a thought. I got some stats here, actually. So Wyoming has the count of females who are probably of voting age, I'm doing a little extrapolation, is about 205,000 people. And the number of registered females is only 115,000. So assuming that maybe there's a barrier because they're felons or whatever, some of that, still you've got only about half people of eligible age registered to vote. And perhaps it's a little naive, but I think once you're registered to vote and someone is out there courting your vote and you think you have a voice in that election, I think maybe, you become a player, so to speak. And maybe, the people, the gatekeepers that Cynthia was mentioning, maybe, try to appeal to me and appeal to the mother and the teacher and the other things like that. And knowing that, of course, then turnout is another task, but I think getting people registered is the beginning. It's a necessary beginning. And I know the county clerks would like to do, and registration in a city like Cheyenne is easy, but I think especially someone who is tied to a job, tied to home duties, it's, you got to have it notarized if it's done by mail, or you have to go into the clerk's office. And if you do have some young children in tow, that's not a small task. If you don't have a car, that's a pretty big lift. And there's a thought about doing online registration. So I think that would be, and then so that then it can be notarized online and it can all be done very quickly. Chasing down a notary in itself is kind of a task. So I think encouraging registration, making it easy, accessible, and then I think, if someone's asking me for my vote, I will go out there and see who's running and who are the qualifications. And I think exercising that voice automatically gives you an investment in who wins. And I think, not necessarily the best candidate may not always be female, but I'll take a second look at the female candidate and I'll say, well, what has she got to offer? And I think that, we skip an important step if we skip the registration, I have to say. So I'll just put that out there. And in Laramie County, and these numbers are as of 4 o'clock this afternoon. So the county has about 99,000 people. So by just, again, extrapolating, about 40,000 women in a voting age, probably. And actually there are 18,000, well, about almost 19,000 registered females. And they outnumber the registered males by 2,000. So, so I think we're doing, there's a lot of people need to be engaged, to be registered, and to understand that they have a voice. So, we can register on the day of elections, and that's very good. But I think, once again, if you're registered ahead of time, maybe you're listening, maybe you're paying attention. So I had to beat that drum a little bit.
Well, sorry, go ahead, Cynthia. I want to just really quickly see if Representative Clifford is back with us. Representative Clifford, are you here? Okay, good.
I'm here.
Okay, I have a question for you as soon as Cynthia jumps in.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'll just say that the work to have universal voter registration or automatic voter registration has had phenomenal success in some states where it's been passed unanimously by both parties and supported. And I think that's a direction. Everything that Marguerite said is for sure true, but a further upstream solution is just getting everybody registered, and so that it's not left to, it's making it an opt-out system instead of an opt-in system. That's what most developed democracies do, and I'm confident with leadership from Amber and others that we could get that done in the United States. But I think that's really the direction of modernization that we need to be going in.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. And Representative Clifford, what I was hoping you would weigh in on is how some of these efforts play out on the Wind River Reservation. whether that is the absentee ballot effort or the notarization or any of the other sort of obstacles that have been identified, and what it means for voter registration and voter participation for Indigenous people in Wyoming.
Yeah, with the pandemic going on, I've been in conversation with tribal leaders and our county clerk here. I did do a video for my constituents here on the Wind River Reservation for the absentee information and request form that was mailed out to every registered voter. And so I'm encouraging that. The big thing, I guess, and I agree with Marguerite, is registering people. I need more of my people registered. We did a great job in 2018. My people like, Indigenous people like incentives. And so I did some t-shirts and I really followed up with them, and I used social media. And the #1 social media for me in this area is gonna be Facebook. Trying to expand to Instagram and Snapchat. I got to get the younger voters going. And I know they're doing the remote online notarization. They have it with outside of the state, but you know, the county clerk talking, it's like, well, just have them call me. And I try to tell her, they're not going to call you. My constituents are just not going to call you. And so please let me work with you. Let me get the voice out. I'm a familiar face. I can educate them, say it in a way that they understand and they're not overwhelmed. And so it's just the information, making it simple and, you know, just repeating it over and over again. And that, I think that's just important. And again, with Marguerite, my push again is the registration part of it. And then getting them to the polls that you have to vote. Yeah, you got it. You registered 2018. This is going to be important. Your voice matters. You know, we need change. But in the conversations I've been having with a lot of women here, again, the grandmas and everybody is, this is consequential election, and people get that. Indigenous people get that. They just do. And the silver lining of the times that we're in now because of the pandemic and the political culture, or the political arena we're in now, the silver lining is a lot of people learned a lot of things that they never would have normally learned. A lot of processes, just a lot of things, right? They've learned a lot of things they had no idea of. And I think the silver lining is I can make a difference, and I do need to register, and I need to go to the polls, and I need to cast a ballot, both the primary and the general. And so mine is little bits and pieces of information, and I make it bite-sized. I don't try to overwhelm them as much. And I think that's crucial. That's so crucial. And so with the pandemic going on, we have a lot of food drives here. I'm gonna start utilizing those for people when they come in and get the food and all of that. And I want people to be safe. You know, we've had a lot of deaths due to the pandemic here in the state of Wyoming. Almost half the deaths here. And I think it's important to be safe. And I am encouraging them to do the absentee ballots for both elections. And that's got to be really really crucial. But again, transportation, you know, that's the important thing. Where to notarize. The Secretary of State did get on a call with the county clerk and a couple of other county legislators here. And so we started a conversation because we have a lot of our people that are positive. And so we're trying to be safe. So how do you go and register somebody that keeps testing positive for COVID, right? Like we have those scenarios. What do we do if they want to vote, you know? And so what I had asked is for a ballot drop-off box. We have one where we have to drive to Lander or Riverton. I asked for one on the reservation. We'll see where that goes. I asked the question. I kind of threw it out there. We'll see where that goes. We have 2 registry agents who are of the Arapaho tribe, enrolled members. And I'm trying to work on possibly with the Shoshone tribe, getting registry agents as well. So the tribal members can go on up there and get registered through them. Our county clerk did sit at the Fort Washakie Clinic last week and did a voter registration drive, and she said it went very well. And so that's good to hear. But again, it's going to be everything we talked about, transportation, the babysitting issue, and still feeling like my vote doesn't matter, like it's not going to make a difference. But I think I can twist and keep pushing the conversation that it does, and just reaching out social media and just having a conversation with a lot of my constituents. And I think they get it. And I know a lot of my strong Indigenous women, they get it. They get it. And so I just need to recruit them to volunteer to continue to have these conversations, these important, crucial conversations, because we have a mutual respect, right? Like, I care about you, you care about me, and the mutual purpose that, you know, we got to do something, right? And that meaning is, you know, for families, for our young ones, for our vulnerable populations, you know, we do make a difference. Small, but it's important. And, you know, all of these reforms are awesome. Like, they're just really, really, really great in these processes, and we need them. And my push has always been to increase voter access and voter participation. I think I'm doing it because of this community. And maybe there's 3 steps that somebody's going to recommend, and maybe only 2 work for Wind River. You know, 2 are going to resonate for the people of Wind River. And that's what I'll push, you know, to get them to the polls or get them registered.
I appreciate that. And I think that you've also, among all of the points that you've made, you also made a point that popped up in the chat as well, which is Wyoming is one of only a few states that requires notarization to register absentee, that you either have to appear in person or you have to register. And in the face of a pandemic, that's really problematic because you still need to interact with other people. You still are going to need to leave your house. So I think that presents an extra obstacle. Given that we just have a few minutes left before we wrap up, I would love, I'm sort of torn. I want everybody to weigh in on, like, if you had a magic wand, what would you do? But I also really always love to hear people's first voter experiences. Like, what got you to the polls? Did you go with a family member? Was it something that happened in your house? So I'd be curious if anybody's willing to field that question. And if you're not, magic wand it is. Please tell us what you do to fix the system and elect more women. Anyone want to jump in? I can be more specific. Go, Marguerite.
Well, and I'll just pitch the idea of a multi-member districts. What Wyoming has already, our 2 House districts are embedded in every Senate district. And we're going to be redrawing lines next year after the decennial census. So there's an opportunity here. And someone suggested to me, and actually it was the lawsuit by the League of Women Voters in 1992 that went from this horse race of 10 people running at large to single-member districts. But you could do a 2-member district and make those House districts combine into a 2-member district. And I think, and the League, we're going to lobby for that as probably corporations, whatever select committee takes it on. And we are going to suggest that so that it's not 3 to 5 like in Maryland, but I think 2 could make a big enough difference. And for whatever psychological reasons, I think a qualified woman will rise, get the attention, and I'm thinking also the other thing is how many uncontested incumbents we have. It's kind of shameful. So it would also solve that problem. And so that's going to be one of the things we're going to work for in the coming interim. So just
love it. Thank you. I just want to make a quick observation. Somebody else pointed this out to me, that the committee that controls this in the state is corporations, elections, and political subdivisions, and that somebody pointed out sort of the general irony of having the corporations committee be in charge of elections, which I hadn't really noticed before, just sort of in the water here. But anyway, for what it's worth, Amber, I think you were going to jump in.
Sure. Can I pick the magic wand question?
Yeah, do it, please, everybody.
So look, I've made my entire career has been about putting voters first and meeting people where they are. And, to contrast a notary requirement on registering to vote, You go south to Colorado, and what we did with the reform is we implemented automatic registration, same-day registration, automatic address updates, automatic ballots, your product coming to you once you're automatically registered to vote comes to you. So you literally get registered to vote and a ballot coming to your house without you filling out a piece of paper. And that is significant, right? That kind of level of service, meeting people where they are in their everyday lives, is why Colorado's system was resilient in a pandemic. And it's why Washington and Oregon and Utah, California, all of these states have not had to make significant adjustments to their process the way that 40 some other states have had to. So, you know, the voting transaction, engaging more voters, being more respectful to voters, meeting voters where they are in their communities matters. And there are solutions for this. And we know what works, just like ranked choice voting. And we know what works in other countries. We know what's worked in various cities around the country. We know what moves the needle on all of these things. And so there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. We need to replicate, adopt, adapt the systems that we know work, that work for states. We also know that different communities are going to have different needs. And, you know, I really appreciated what Representative Clifford talked about with the reservations, because one of the other solutions that I actually created when I was running Denver's elections was a mobile voting unit. And that unit was designed to fill gaps in communities where there wasn't good voting infrastructure, or there wasn't a good polling place location, or there wasn't a good vote center. And so it's a mobile unit that can go anywhere. And can you imagine a mobile unit being available within a state or within a jurisdiction that can literally travel around and be available on different days at different times leading up to the election? That's how you meet people where they are. And so my magic wand is, you know, certainly the voting transaction, from voter registration all the way through to casting a ballot. We need to do a better job of delivering service to the American people. And the difference between being a Colorado voter and being a Wyoming voter should not be this giant, massive, wide array when we're talking about a presidential election or all of these things. And so we have to meet people where they are. We have government systems that can automatically register people to vote. The amount of spend that happens by voter registration drives and groups like the League of Women Voters to fill the gap of registration when that should be the government doing that is insane. And so we've got to do a better job of doing this. And then I second all of the other reforms we all talk about: redistricting, fairness in primaries, all of these other issues that come up to provide a better, more fair solution for every voter.
And I want to say that the points that you're making are so incredibly important, and remind me, and to remind all of us, that in those states where voter access is more universal, there are more options, and you've met the voters where they are, they've elected more women. Colorado has a significant number of women in the state legislature and at all levels. And so I want to hand it over to you, Cynthia, for your magic wand. Now I've pivoted. Everybody has to use the magic wand. Cynthia, your magic wand, and then we'll close it out, Representative Clifford, with your magic wand.
Great. Well, I'll just try to be super quick. The thing that I think I would do with, I hope that I can maybe have a couple magic wands, but my first magic wand would be to look at the way we elect Congress, because that serves as a model for how state legislatures work and cities work. And so if you looked at Congress, I would probably expand the number of representatives we have, because we haven't done that since 1910 for no particularly good reason. Though when I bring it up, people say, well, there are only 435 chairs. I'm like, that is not the reason to have that many number of people serving us in government. So I would expand the House, maybe add about 110 or so. Most of those seats would go to new voices in politics, women, people of color, lower income people, rural people, et cetera, et cetera. We like to call it an incumbency protection. It would make incumbents feel better about the other reforms if they didn't feel like they were going to lose their seat. And then I would institute multi-seat districts with ranked choice voting, so that voters in every district in every part of the country would be able to elect a candidate of choice. There would be multiple constituencies of color elected from a district, not just, oh, that's the African-American district or that's the Latino district, but actually people would be reflected in the legislature according to their strength in the electorate. More women would get elected, there'd be more civility, less polarization, combined with all of Amber's and the other terrific reforms. I think that's the model when you really think of a more competitive elections in every district. There'd be moderate Republicans elected from Manhattan and conservative Democrats elected from Oklahoma and everywhere in between, maybe even some libertarians and some Greens. I think that's really the gold standard in my book. And then that sets up the model for states to follow suit and city councils to think about instituting that combination of ranked choice voting with multi-seat districts. Sorry, I didn't take too much time.
No, that was awesome. Thank you. And Representative Clifford, magic wand to close us out.
Oh, in my journey in increasing voter access and participation, I guess my magic wand, what I want to hit on is restoration of voting rights, making it easy, making it simpler, just reforming all of that. It's so important, and they're still important community members, and I have a large population of them here that I wish I could help them, and that's my goal. So I guess that would be my magic wand is putting that to the forefront, making it easier, and having all this data and stats saying, we got 60%, of the people that have their voting rights restored for whatever reason. I think that would be good. And, they're still part of our communities. They're still going to be here, and they should have a voice. And they're not all bad people. People change. They make mistakes and stuff, but a lot of people learn from them. So that would be my magic one.
I love it. Well, thank you. I want to say thank you to all of you for showing up and engaging and making this just a fantastic hour for me, selfishly. So thank you to all of you. Thank you for the work that you're doing and the voices that you're representing out there, because I think that this is the kind of conversation that genuinely drives change in our communities. And so it's exciting to have, it's exciting to hear, and hopefully all of our folks who have been on the call will continue to engage and help us move some of these magic wand ideas forward. I have still not figured out a really good way to applaud for panels via Zoom. So if anybody has any suggestions, but thank you. We cannot thank you enough. And I'm going to hand it back over to Anna to bring us home.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining us for the People's Review Live. And just another heads up, the Equality State Policy Center is a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit organization, and we really rely on charitable gifts to fund all of our work. Donations can be made on the web at the link in there. And then also, if you're interested, you can send us a check at 419 South 5th Street, Laramie, Wyoming, 82070. And if you'd like to sponsor the series, let us know. And if you'd like to sign up for newsletter, action alerts, or make a donation, just go to that website. And thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you at the next People's Review Live.